Much like Theranos, Ozzy seemed to thrive in a culture of PR and hype, until it didn't. And it's not a stretch to wonder how Elizabeth Holmes fits into the larger story, whether she's in a...
I have got it out. I have got it out. Listen and fucking it. Listen and fucking it. Okay. Someone was dropping out. They kept marching on. Cyber international computer attacking America. They're not on. They got nice looking scientists, nice looking doctors. Excuse me, please. Oh, era. Family, food, sport, army, family.
Mr. Rosendorf goes, yes, September does come after August. And everyone kind of laughs. And I'm like, wow, okay.
Emma was attending the trial as an assignment for her government class at nearby Los Gatos High School.
We had this thing called political participation, where we were supposed to observe basically something having to do with the government. And then also some of the English teachers have actually assigned your podcast, The Dropout, as like assigned listening. And so I just thought that would be a really interesting thing to do for my project.
But that's not Emma's only connection to this story.
In the atmosphere of my high school, we've had, of course, Mr. Alex Schultz as a former biology teacher. He retired last year. He taught both biology and biology honors. And he's Tyler Schultz's father, and of course, George Schultz's son.
That's right. The son of Theranos board member George Schultz and the father of Theranos whistleblower Tyler Schultz was a biology teacher at Emma's school. It's the kind of connection you see a lot of in Silicon Valley. With such a monumental story unfolding so close to home, Emma says she can't help but imagine the longer-term implications for her community. You're a young person living in Silicon Valley right now. What will the takeaway be for people like you?
Well, I think definitely if she gets off, people are going to be like, wow, a company could do something that bad, because it's pretty much accepted, at least where I live, that like she's guilty. Like that's what people think. And I'm sure that'll lead some people to think that maybe they can start their own fraudulent company someday. So that would be bad. But I think if she's convicted, then people will think like, okay, there is, there's justice if you have like a fraud, and that's going to be the punishment.
This is Brad Milkey, host of ABC's daily news podcast, Start Here. More Dropout in a minute, but first, a quick reminder, if you're looking for a daily recap of the day's news, including updates on the Elizabeth Holmes trial, join me over on Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. Again, that's Start Here, available wherever you listen.
As the story of Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes has been unfolding in Emma's backyard, it's been hard to look away this week from the other big tech and startup stories unfolding in our collective backyard. From the Facebook whistleblower coming forward.
I'm here today because I believe Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy.
To allegations that startup Aussie Media faked its numbers while soliciting investors, as New York Times media columnist Ben Smith reported.
According to the New York Times, the company's chief operating officer impersonated a YouTube executive on a call with Goldman Sachs while attempting to raise money from the investment bank.
Carlos Watson, Ozzy's co-founder, appearing in an interview on CNBC, drew comparisons to Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos.
Were there any other occasions where investors were given misleading information, or was that a one-off event?
Becky, I hope and I believe that was a one-off event. I think it's completely inappropriate and not thoughtful, these kind of comparisons to Theranos. You and I both...
Ozzy denies some of the allegations, but some of them, like the COO impersonating a YouTube employee, are undisputed. Much like Theranos, Ozzy seemed to thrive in a culture of PR and hype, until it didn't. And it's not a stretch to wonder how Elizabeth Holmes fits into the larger story, whether she's an anomaly or an indicator of something bigger.
I think that the people who would like to position Theranos as a unique exception will find evidence to make that case.
Roger McNamee spent 34 years investing in companies.
The notion that you could raise hundreds of millions of dollars for a medical testing company run by a person under the age of 30 was something that would have been vanishingly unlikely prior to 2000, but didn't seem out of place in the environment of the first decade of this century.
McNamee was an early investor in Facebook, an advisor to Mark Zuckerberg, a co-founder of private equity firm Elevation Partners, and he was approached early on to invest in Theranos. Today, McNamee calls himself an activist. He stepped away from the firm he co-founded, and he's the author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe.
I realized that the most successful investments coming out of the Valley were all going to have these predatory business models with ridiculous amounts of capital against income statements that might never generate a profit. And that caused me to tell my partners, I've passed my sell-by date. This is not a culture I'm comfortable in. I mean, you guys hang around, God bless. I mean, good luck, enjoy it. I hope it works out well. And obviously it worked out fantastically, but it was not something I was comfortable with.
McNamee says to really understand the culture of Silicon Valley today and how Theranos fits in, you need to look at its history.
I think of Silicon Valley as having had 3 sociological eras. So that first era, which really ran from 1956 until the late 70s, was dominated by the government as the primary customer. So it was military and space for the most part. We're going to the moon.
And counting, and Apollo 13 is go.
In the 70s, we saw the beginnings of the hippie value system coming into Silicon Valley. It began with Atari.
A world beyond your wildest dreams. Discover Atari.
It was then followed by Apple.
January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh.
And what was really interesting was that the two were surprisingly compatible. As straight-laced as the space program folks were, their idealism and their desire to make the world better with technology meshed perfectly with the counterculture folks that built Atari and then Apple.
Heading into the late 90s, it was also expensive to start a tech company, and there were lots of barriers to entry.
The companies had to spend between $100 and $150 million on infrastructure just to launch a website. And because of that, the average age of the entrepreneurs was pretty old because you were not going to trust $150 million to a kid.
But after the internet bubble burst in the early 2000s, McNamee says everything changed.
The limitations that engineers had been under for the prior 50 years, which were limitations of processing power, memory, storage, and bandwidth, began to evaporate. So instead of requiring $150 million to launch a product, all you needed was an American Express card or a Visa card. Anybody could do it. And it turned out everybody did.
Everybody did, including Elizabeth Holmes and another dropout from across the country named Mark Zuckerberg. Just as Mark was founding Facebook in 2004, Elizabeth was getting Theranos off the ground. Not only were the barriers coming down, but the culture was also changing, according to McNamee. And suddenly, these young innovators were exactly what investors wanted.
The people making the investments, they were attracted to a certain kind of person who really focused on size, speed, and efficiency. The notion was move as fast as you possibly can, get as big as you possibly can, and don't let any obstacle get in your way. That became the prevailing culture of entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley.
You never know what you're going to get on this show. That's all I'm going to tell you.
Yes, Whoopi! Is this mic on? Can you hear me out there?
Behind the scenes is always a better show.
Absolutely.
Always.
Absolutely.
That's what people don't see during the commercial break.
Right. They don't.
What happened?
I had no idea really what I was getting myself into.
That day that we walked out, I treasure that day. I couldn't sit there.
You're doing good, Joy. You're doing good. Oh, yeah, baby.
It was crazy.
The View, Behind the Table, wherever you get your podcasts.
I want to tell you about another podcast you might like, one where you might be able to help write the ending. Hear me out. The year is 1998. A New York computer salesman named John Rufo has just been sentenced for his role in one of the largest fraud scams in American history. He's ordered to show up for his prison sentence, but instead he just vanishes. Now, all these years later, the U.S. Marshals and our team are following the clues, tracking down leads from across the country and around the world, all along the way, asking the question, have you seen this man? Help crack the case. The podcast is Have You Seen This Man? And it's available now, wherever you listen.
This culture of bold and disruptive entrepreneurship was very much present, according to McNamee, when he says a friend on Theranos' board approached him to invest in the blood testing startup.
I explained to my friend I wasn't likely to do it because I really didn't do healthcare. He said, no, this is so great, you got to look at it. And I go, okay, great, give me the pitch. So he walks me through the slide deck. And the idea was that we were going to take a drop of blood and it was going to revolutionize medical testing because you were going to be able to identify all these incredibly terrifying diseases. And because it was just a drop of blood, you were going to get people tested way more often, and therefore it was going to radically transform public health. Now, I'm not an investor in medical devices, but I had worked a long part of my career in a firm that was huge in it. And so I had at least been exposed to these companies. And the thing I know is that when you get a blood test, they take vials of blood. And these guys were going to go from that down to a pinprick without any intervening steps. They were just going to do this all in one shot. And I went, I can't speak for medical devices, but I know that in my world of technology, that's not possible. That you have to make incremental approaches and you get there in a series of steps. What's your interim strategy? They go, no. We're going to go straight there. We've broken the code. And I said to my friend, wow, that's something that in my world, I would look at with great suspicion. And he goes, no, we're on top of this. And I go, well, God bless, but I'm not going to do it.
But others did. And McNamee says Theranos played right into the groupthink of the moment.
I mean, it would have been great if it had worked, but people started to believe this notion that if you raised enough money and you moved fast enough, success would be a self-fulfilling prophecy, that you would be able to overwhelm any challenge. This is the exact principle that went into Uber, the exact principle that went into WeWork.
There's an argument from Elizabeth's legal team that she couldn't have deceived investors because these were highly sophisticated people. They should have known they were taking a risk. What do you say to that?
I would say she's correct that these people pretend to be highly sophisticated. I think those people allowed themselves to be duped, and that in no way absolves her of responsibility for the things she'd said or things she did. Look, it pays you money and you take your chance. That's the investment business. People lose money all the time, but you're not allowed to lie to people. You're not allowed to pretend you're doing one thing when you're actually doing something quite different. There are very clear laws on that, and Theranos appears to have gone way over that line.
Theranos received some of the biggest checks from the likes of Rupert Murdoch and the Walton family, heir to the Walmart fortune. Not sophisticated venture capital biotech investors. But McNamee believes another fundamental shift worked to Elizabeth's advantage. Interest rates, that is the cost of borrowing, crash after the dot-com bubble burst, and again after the financial crisis. This meant investors had access to free-flowing, cheap capital, and it ended up finding a home in what were promising to be high-growth companies like Theranos.
That philosophy, I can tell you, did not exist until the late 90s. Before that, people were really careful about where they put their money, especially in the venture capital field. I mean, they made mistakes, but beginning in the late 90s, when you started to put the phrase .com on the tail end of any descriptive word for an industry, so pets.com and all that, that was the beginning of fantasy land.
In fact, the amount of money flowing into companies from the venture capital community went from roughly $30 billion in 1990, according to the National Venture Capital Association, to a staggering $220 billion by 2000. Today, those numbers continue to climb to more than $470 billion. And with the trial of Elizabeth Holmes underway, a handful of noted venture investors have recently said Theranos is not indicative of the overall culture of Silicon Valley. I asked McNamee what he thought about this position. He says Elizabeth is unique for some reasons, but he also sees similarities between Theranos' business model, raise a lot of money to do the impossible, that isn't that far off from the rest of Silicon Valley. McNamee doesn't see any of this ending well.
Silicon Valley is an incredibly male-dominated culture. And if I were they, I'd say the same thing, right? You're trying to make Theranos appear to be an exception. And in some ways it is an exception. But in many ways, it's just the prototype for a lot of businesses that followed it. Now, it had the misfortune of not getting to a large enough scale before the charade was exposed. The thing about Elizabeth Holmes that I look at that gives me great hope for humanity, you wouldn't have had to go back more than 5 years when it would have been impossible for a woman to raise that kind of money, even for a really great idea. But yeah, men had been raising money for bad ideas for a really long time. And I thought, well, there is definitely a silver lining here because I'm really happy to see that women are getting a chance to do this. And I feel that same way about it. If it turns out it was a scam, I'm going to feel the same way about it, which is that actually represents a form of social progress.
What role do you see the media playing in all?
ABC News.
Hello, Amber Jacobs.
I'm just saying that debating, more protest, scared the government, shot the police, go, the police power.
With the latest headlines, the Home of...
Fuck the police. Be nice, I love you, get married, wife, man. Family, please.
Affairs Minister. Hello, Amber Jacobs with the...
Fuck you, cantapá. Excuse me, please. Excuse me, perdón. Manes, love you. Family food.
The latest headlines. The Home Affairs Minister, Karen Andrews, says she hopes a new child abuse prevention strategy will reduce what she's described as the terrible rate of child exploitation in Australia. The $300 million plan has been launched today and involves a public awareness campaign, more training for police officers, and early intervention programs for potential offenders. The federal Greens say Israel's decision to...
Wait a minute, how about the lower majority that don't want to get vaccinated and they own drugs and you're selling them cigarettes and marijuana, synthetics? What are you doing, motherfuckers? Love you. Corrupt, man. They didn't say the lower, they didn't want to do it. The one on drugs, the ones on different thinking, other dimension, they didn't say that. They fucking lie, man. Did you hear it? Lower majority because family army food because
declare 6 for police officers and early intervention programs for potential offenders. The federal Greens say Israel's decision to declare 6 Palestinian human rights groups as terrorist organisations is an outrageous move. Israel's Defence Ministry has accused the groups of covertly financing a group with an armed wing that has carried out deadly attacks against Israelis. Human Rights Watch says Israel...
ABC News.
Andrew Kalupas with the latest. The Prime Minister says Australia will share another 10 million vaccine doses with Southeast Asian nations within the next 8 months. It'll be drawn from the 60 million doses which the government is committed to sharing with countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Scott Morrison has told Southeast Asian leaders that Australia has shared 4 million doses with the region so far. Forensic police have returned to the Blowholes campsite in remote West Australia, from which it's believed 4-year-old Cleo Smith was snatched 12 days ago. The disappearance of the little girl from the family tent in the early hours of the morning has sparked a massive search and prompted the offer of $1 million reward for information that leads to her whereabouts. Police have also spent more time at the family home in Carnarvon, but reiterated there's no suggestion they're involved in her disappearance. New South Wales police have expanded their search for an alleged drug kingpin amid fears he could flee the country. Days after being granted bail, Mustafa Balouch cut off his electronic monitoring bracelet and disappeared, sparking calls for tougher bail laws. The 33-year-old is charged over an alleged attempt to import hundreds of millions of dollars of cocaine from overseas. Police say there are multiple theories at play, including that he potentially boarded a private jet.
ABC News.
Andrew Kalupas with the latest. The National Party has given in-principle support to back a target of net zero emissions for Australia by 2050. 21 members and senators met Sunday afternoon to discuss the issue, with some worried it could result in job losses in regional areas. But Nationals leader Barnaby Joyce says most concerns have been allayed and the majority are now on board with the plan. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has welcomed the Nationals' support to back the target. Mr Morrison agreed to altering the original climate policy to get the Nationals on board. The Victorian government has unveiled a raft of eased restrictions as the state hits the 80% and then 90% fully vaccinated milestones. Premier Daniel Andrews says life will be back to near normal once Victoria reaches 90% of over 12-year-olds being double-dosed, which is projected to be on or about the 24th of November. He says to help get there, all non-essential retail will need to be fully vaccinated to work and shop, and there'll be what he calls a one-off approval gateway for all events. West Australian police are searching for a vehicle seen leaving a campsite in the state's north from where 4-year-old Cleo Smith disappeared more than a week ago. After an extensive search for the girl in and around the Blowholes campsite, about 70 kilometres north of Carnarvon, police now believe she was abducted. Police say witnesses have come forward saying they saw a passenger vehicle leaving the campsite between 3 and 3:30 last Saturday morning. Colombia's president has welcomed the capture of the head of the country's biggest criminal gang. Authorities have confirmed Dario Antonio Usega, a notorious drug trafficker and leader of the Gulf clan, has been apprehended. He was caught in a major operation carried out by the country's armed forces during which a policeman was killed. Usega's cartel smuggled hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cocaine into the US and as far as Russia.
ABC News.
Alexia Atwood with the latest news headlines.
What's it called? They ain't giving the information to anti-government or anti-corruption. We love you, YouTube. We'll join YouTube. Subscribe. Opinion, good manners. I love you. Family food. Don't eat, don't cheat, you die. Champion. I'm fun. Family. Excuse me, please.
The United Nations has slammed...
excuse me, please. Excuse me, please. Whoop, I'm moving my hands. I'm shaking. Ooh, I'm fairly small. Shaking my hands. Love you, sexy. Family food. You bait.
Developed countries for their lack of leadership.
ABC News.
Alexia Atwood with the latest news headlines. The United Nations has slammed developed countries for their lack of leadership in combating climate change. A new report states current efforts to cut emissions fall well short of what's needed. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, their lack of leadership.
ABC News.
Alexia Atwood with the latest news headlines. The United Nations has slammed developed countries for their lack of leadership in combating climate change. A new report states current efforts to cut emissions fall well short of what's needed. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres describes it as a wake-up call for governments around the world.
ABC News.
Alexia Atwood with the latest news headlines. The United Nations has slammed developed countries for their lack of leadership in combating climate change. A new report states current efforts to cut emissions fall well short of what's needed. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres described leadership in combating climate change. A new report states... Alexia Atwood with the latest news headlines. The United Nations has slammed developed countries for their lack of leadership in combating climate change. Alexia Atwood with the latest news headlines. The United Nations has slammed developed countries for their lack of leadership in combating climate change. Alexia Atwood with the latest news headlines. The United Nations has slammed developed countries for their lack of leadership in combating climate change. A new report states current efforts to cut Atwood with the latest news headlines. The United Nations has slammed developed countries for their lack of leadership in combating climate change. A new report states Alexia Atwood with the latest news headlines. The United Nations has slammed developed countries for their lack of leadership in combating climate change. A new report states current efforts to cut emissions fall well short of what's needed. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres described it as a wake-up call for governments around the world. The Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine could be approved for 5 to 11-year-old children in Australia by the end of November. The medical regulator has now received most of the safety and efficacy data from Pfizer about its vaccine, but still needs some final information before a decision can be made. In other news, a US prosecutor investigating last week's accidental fatal shooting on a film set says the weapon Alec Baldwin used was a real gun, not a prop. In an interview with the New York Times, the Santa Fe County District Attorney described the weapon, which the actor had been assured would fire only blanks, as an antique-era appropriate gun. And the ACT has hit a critical vaccination milestone, with 90% of the eligible population now fully protected against COVID-19. It comes ahead of a further easing of restrictions in the territory on Friday. ABC News.
ABC News.
Hello, Amber Jacobs with the latest headlines. The federal government predicts 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. Hello, Amber Jacobs with the latest headlines. The federal government predicts... The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says the economic modelling underpinning the government's planned vaccine 6 months on from their second dose. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says the economic modelling underpinning the government's plan to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 will be released in the coming weeks. Morrison says the economic modelling underpinning the government of any vaccine 6 months on from their second... Hello, Amber Jacobs with the 6 months on from their second dose. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says the economic modelling underpinning the government's plan to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 will be released in the coming... Scott Morrison. Hello, Amber Jacobs with the latest headlines. The federal government with the latest headlines. Hello, Amber Jacobs with the latest headlines. The federal government predicts 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians will have received a first dose of a vaccine by the first week of December. Vaccination rates among Indigenous Australians continue to lag behind the broader population. The rollout of COVID booster shots to the general public is expected to begin on November the 8th. The medical regulator has approved the Pfizer vaccine for use as a booster in people aged over 18. It'll be offered to anyone who's received 2 doses of any vaccine.
Oh, fuck, hey, well, how do we bat it? Do we have to have these chemicals, metals, try to vaccine into our bodies? Who is the ruler of our bodies? How do we scare our bodies? Who is lawsuits of our bodies? Am I allowed to say opinions? How do we have shots after shots? I love you. How is coronavirus going into your body? Please fix it with vaccine, please. YouTube, very nice. I love you. Fix coronavirus vaccine, please. Menace. Excuse me, police.
6 months on from the population. The rollout of COVID booster shots to the general public is expected to begin on November the 8th. The medical regulator the broader first dose of a vaccine by the first week of December. Vaccination rates among Indigenous Australians continue to lag behind the broader population. The rollout of COVID booster shots to the general public is expected to begin on November the 8th. The medical regulator has approved the Pfizer vaccine for use as a booster. Shots to the general public is expected to begin on November. A first dose of a vaccine by the first week of December. Vaccination rates among Indigenous Australians continue to lag behind the broader population. The rollout of COVID booster shots to the general public is expected to begin on November the 8th. The medical regulator has approved the Pfizer vaccine for use as a booster in people aged over 18. It'll be offered to anyone who's received 2 doses of any vaccine 6 months on from their second dose. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says the economic modelling underpinning the government's plan to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 will be released in the coming weeks. The government yesterday released its long-awaited plan to get Australia's economy carbon neutral by the middle of the century. Also making headlines, 75 businesses have told the tax office they'll voluntarily pay back some or all of the JobKeeper payments they received. ABC News.
ABC News.
Alexia Atwood with the latest news. Border checkpoints saw 21,000 vehicles on Tuesday, but the Queensland border expecting to be let in, mistakenly believing that the state had already eased its restrictions. Border checkpoints saw 21,000 vehicles on Tuesday, mainly at the Coolangatta Tweed crossing. Believing that the state had already eased its restrictions. Border checkpoints saw 21,000 vehicles on Tuesday, mainly at the Coolangatta Tweed crossing. Mistakenly believing that the state had already eased its restrictions. Border checkpoints saw 21,000 vehicles on Tuesday, mainly at the Coolangatta Tweed crossing. A group of Australian health workers and members of the Australian Defence Force have flown to Papua New Guinea to help the country deal with its COVID-19 outbreak. Major hospitals throughout the 11th hour commitment to net zero has been criticised for its lack of detail and for relying on unproven technologies. Catastrophic climate change. But the government's 11th hour commitment to net zero has been criticised for its lack of detail and for relying on unproven technologies. Police say too many people are turning up at the Queensland border expecting to be let in, mistakenly believing that the state had already eased its restrictions. Border checkpoints saw 21,000 vehicles on Tuesday. Atwood with the latest. Alexia Atwood with the latest news headlines. Australia's plan to reach net zero emissions is set to be tested on the world stage as the Prime Minister prepares to leave the country today for COP26 in Glasgow. Scott Morrison will head to Rome for a G20 meeting before making his way to Scotland for talks billed as the last chance for meaningful action to avoid catastrophic climate change. But the government's 11th hour commitment to net zero has been criticised for its lack of detail and for relying on unproven technologies. Police say too many people are turning up at the Queensland border expecting to be let in, mistakenly believing that the state had already eased its restrictions. Border checkpoints saw 21,000 vehicles on Tuesday, mainly at the Coolangatta Tweed crossing. A group of Australian health workers and members of the Australian Defence Force have flown to Papua New Guinea to help the country deal with its COVID-19 outbreak. Major hospitals throughout PNG are struggling to cope with the surge in COVID-19 cases. And despite lockdowns outside Sydney and Melbourne over recent months, there's still been an uptick in the number of people who've moved from capital cities to regional areas to live. That's according to the Regional Australia Institute, a not-for-profit think tank that used data from the Commonwealth Bank to examine where residents had relocated to during the September quarter. ABC News.
ABC News.
Rule it out. ABC News. Sightings of unexplained. And the Air Force says Australia won't follow the Pentagon in formally investigating UFOs. It insists pilots here have not reported any sightings of unexplained objects. In June, the Pentagon's declassified formally that they believe killed Helena Hutchins, but have refused to comment on possible charges. And the Air Force says Australia won't follow the Pentagon in formally investigating UFOs. It insists pilots here have not reported any sightings of unexplained objects. In June, the Pentagon's declassified report found no clear indication that there is any non-terrestrial explanation for objects seen flying erratically in the sky, but did not rule it. The report found no clear indication that there is any non-terrestrial explanation for unexplained objects. It says Australia won't follow the Pentagon live projectile that they believe killed Helena Hutchins, but have refused to comment on possible charges. And the Air Force says Australia won't follow the Pentagon in formally investigating UFOs. It insists pilots here have not reported any sightings of unexplained objects. In June, the Pentagon's declassified report found no clear indication that there is any non-terrestrial explanation for unexplained objects. In June, the Pentagon's declassified report found no clear UFOs. It insists pilots here have not reported any sightings of unexplained objects. In June, the Pentagon's declassified report found no clear indication that there is any non-terrestrial explanation for objects seen flying erratically in the sky, but did not rule it out. ABC News.
I'm cutting it out. This is God. This is God. God. Hope you do something. Enjoying the YouTube's on the YouTube. God. God, it's world record. Okay. Oh, excuse. I'm late. Oh, I'm naughty. Not doing my chores. Oops, I'm not gonna get a girlfriend. Excuse me, please.
Much like Theron.